And I think you had some good suggestions on the way forward. And one of the things that you raised was green bonds. And we have Jessica here who can tell us more about how you're trying to promote or make it more visible and more transparent, the green bonds and the kind of impact that they have. You already presented this morning, but we'll go into more depth now, especially on the green bonds initiative or green bonds evaluation. So thank you, Jessica.
Hi there. So I've moved my slides around a little bit from this morning, just to kind of vary the material that we're going to cover. So I will mention a small amount about the Green Bond initiative again, but I was also going to talk around a few of the other initiatives that we've been involved in, and also some research that I thought you guys would find really interesting on the issue of scaling up private finance. So the first one I wanted to run by you, a couple of people have mentioned it already, but it's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And this was released this year. It was put together by the private sector for the private sector, and it's specifically looking at climate risk. So as you'll see here, it was commissioned, the G20 finance ministers and central bank asked the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, that's headed up by the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, to look at how the financial sector can take account of climate-related issues. So in turn, the FSB TCFD put together these recommendations, and they've been very recently released. And these are going to be, or they were put together by companies that are worth around 1.5 trillion, and also financial institutions with assets of over 20 trillion. So it's a lot of the big players putting these together and really kind of getting involved in this. And really this is important because these are widely adoptable. They are the first time something like this has been kind of released. At the moment, they're quite broad, they're quite high level, and that's so that everybody can engage. And then eventually they'll be kind of further developed and more detail can be added. But as you'll see, broadly, they cover governance, strategy, risk management, and also metrics and targets. And I'm kind of talking about these in this context here at this event because even though they are private sector led, this is really going to kind of drive awareness, and they look at both corporates but also financial institutions, so banks, asset managers, insurers, and that's really where they're going to have impact in regard to kind of more public finance type NDC things. As awareness grows, hopefully this will also build appetite to invest in kind of climate resilient and climate smart projects. As we'll kind of go into detail perhaps in the questions, they've got very specific further supplemental guidance for the financial institutions as well as the corporates. So it's getting insurance companies to kind of think exactly how physical risk is going to impact their portfolios. And that's kind of big. The insurance sector is already better than a lot of the other financial institutions and areas because it is a bit aware of this stuff, but it's getting them to disclose publicly exactly how they assess it and how they take it into account, which is great. And also on the banking side, already some banks are quite progressive and they've got quite strict E&S kind of criteria around how they might lend, but these are kind of asking them to publicly, transparently describe what these metrics and targets and these things that they use, getting them to disclose it and making it kind of open to everybody. And also in that way, they're going to have to think about it themselves. So they're going to also probably become more aware and do more kind of climate smart lending and become more aware of all these risks that are very material to all sectors. So the next point, I wanted to kind of talk around the G20 referencing the TCFD recommendations. So this is a way that we can scale up institutional capacity and also help to deliver the right policies and enabling conditions. We also know that there are a few kind of government entities that are looking to endorse these recommendations, so that's very positive as well. And then there's also the Article 173, and this is a great way to kind of talk about enabling environments and kind of encouraging the private sector to be more aware of climate risks. And as you can see, the French energy transition law that came into force in January 2016 has really driven everything that the TCFD is trying to do, in that it's making disclosure required by law. So it's a really big step, really encouraging, and will probably have a big impact on how investors look at these kind of risks, especially in France. Okay, and then also as the green evaluation. So this is our attempt to kind of help investors see environmental benefit and kind of produce a very transparent score that's going to help investors who are not climate scientists or people who from NGOs or the government who have this kind of understanding of climate risks and things. It's trying to communicate that to people who potentially don't have the same understanding as we in the room might have. And then on to transforming the financial system. So this was a paper by, it's actually by McKinsey, but I wanted to reference it because we've been talking so much about the issues that it covers. So the title of it was How to Mobilize Private Sector Financing for Sustainable Infrastructure. And if this is an area that you are particularly interested in, I can't recommend this paper enough. They come together with 6 recommendations, as you can see on the screen, that they believe will really help to kind of ramp up sustainable finance. So the first one, their recommendation is to scale up investment in sustainable project preparation and pipeline development. And this is kind of getting governments and development banks to help out with the early stages of the project that are the most risky. Because if these projects can be designed and prepared and use the right technical assistance to kind of increase the bankability of these projects, that's going to really improve how able the private sector is to invest in them. So it would be an area that could achieve a lot of progress if done correctly. And currently there is a bit of a chronic shortage, especially in developing countries, for things like developer equity, but also developer expertise. So kind of like Korea mentioned and like you're doing, kind of sharing expertise in this area with developing countries could really make a difference. Number 2, using development capital to finance sustainability premiums. So this is looking at concessional finance. So if you as a government or a development bank can use, say, 300 million to then unlock 1.5 billion, you're doing a lot with that money. You're unlocking, you're using, well, it's 5 times multiple. You've multiplied that money by 5 times through using it in the way of a concessional finance. And that might just be that, say, a first loss guarantee or something like this. So your money might be lost first if it went wrong, but without that, the private sector would not have invested in the project. So in that way, you're unlocking a lot more than you have yourself. So that's another great way to get involved, according to McKinsey. And so number 3, improve the capital markets for sustainable infrastructure by encouraging use of guarantees. So I won't stay on that too long because Korea's already kind of touched on it. But this kind of mechanism whereby used by development banks or governments can also be a really useful one to kind of unlock private finance and enable them to kind of invest and come in. And because private markets are so deep, you know, it's really essential that they are unlocked, especially for this cause. So encourage the use of sustainability criteria in procurement. Now, McKinsey recommend this for governments, in that they could strengthen sustainability criteria in both public procurement processes and public-private partnerships, but also things like banks. For example, a great example is JP Morgan. They've already got a very strict environmental and social policy that governs who they can and can't lend to. And that's a really progressive step. So they will look at projects, say, and they'll look at them in terms of where they are located, but they will absolutely not invest in certain projects in certain areas. For example, coal plants. A lot of coal plants they will just not lend to anymore, and that's based on this environmental and social criteria. And that's a big deal when they're one of the top 5 lenders in the world. Okay, and then so increased syndication of loans. Again, this is a measure that development banks could predominantly kind of encourage to kind of scale up this market. And finally, adapt financial instruments to channel investment to sustainable infrastructure and enhance liquidity. So this is things like yield cos and green bonds, like we mentioned before. They're traditional financial instruments underneath it, but they've just got a sustainability focus. And that's helping to kind of scale up awareness and involvement in the market. But there's also programs as well run by NGOs. For example, the Climate Policy Initiative run the Global Finance Lab for, I'm going to mess up the analogy now, but the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, that's it. And they look at developing these cool new instruments that are focused on scaling up climate finance and also leveraging private finance as well. And these kind of incentives are kind of a really good way to kind of look at this problem as well. Okay. So, and then back to the green evaluation tool. Like I said earlier, it's basically trying to provide more data where there is not enough data, or where the data is so complex that people don't understand it. So it's a relative assessment of environmental benefit for either adaptation or mitigation. And through this, we want to be able to apply it to equity, to loans, to every kind of finance, just so that investors, as well as understanding the credit risk from our traditional products, they also have a grasp of actually what this project is doing in terms of environmental benefit. Okay, and some more of the drivers behind it, but I think I'll leave it there for them for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and also, thank you very much for your interesting insights. And I think this also shows, that a lot of is already going on. I think the disclosure will really, drive investments toward more resilience, and especially also show what resilient investments are, I think. And the points that you mentioned can really drive investment in resilience. And I'm glad you mentioned the Finance Lab. We're actually from the Netherlands. We had two proposals adopted. One is Climate Investor One, where we indeed try to de-risk investments. And the other one is a water bank, which is very, well, maybe Dutch, but other countries might have it as well, which focuses specifically on investing in water infrastructure. But